Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby and this is my co-host,
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support in our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, it is Friday. It is Friday. And we had some big news that happened over the last couple of days. Damian Lillard finally signed with the team. We didn't know where he was going to go. We didn't know when he was going to sign. And he quickly decided. He ended up actually going to the Portland Trail Blazers, right? Which was a move that I don't think anybody really predicted. I know that shortly before he signed, there were insiders. Zach Lowe was the first to put it out there, right? That there was some mutual agreements between, or mutual interest in him going back to Portland, and obviously Portland being all right with him coming back. But obviously when he was first waived and stretched, right, all the reporting was several contenders were interested in him, including obviously Boston, Golden State, other teams. I believe the Lakers were also on that list as well. But they're always on the list, but you know what I mean. Like, just as a whole, like, it was all a lot of contenders. He ended up signing a 3-year, $42 million deal with the Blazers. I believe this also kind of gives him a no-trade clause because then the amount of years of service allows him to have that. So pretty much this contract will take him to more than likely the end of his career. My guess is he probably retires after that contract because he'll be like around 37, 38 or so. $14 million a year, basically. So on top of the $54 million or whatever that he got bought out on. So I believe he gets about $70 million this season. More than likely won't play. So he'll be rehabbing. He'll be going back to Portland where he built up his career, made a name for himself, right? Etched himself into NBA legend. Obviously, he's got a great relationship with the fans. He's got family there. His kids were there for a long time, right? Because that's where, everything happened. And so on the one hand, obviously this is great for him because clearly he didn't really want to be there, right? Like, obviously we know when he first got traded to the Bucks, right? It was not a team that was on the, like, remember going back, because I remember we would literally cover this every single time we would get on and record, right? The primary destination for him was Miami, and he was trying to angle to go to Miami and really nowhere else, but they couldn't get a deal done. So he ended up going to Milwaukee, and he played good soldier. But you could tell he clearly didn't want to be there. But the thought process was, well, hopefully we'll win, right? And if we win, then that'll kind of make up for it. And Milwaukee didn't win. They disappointed. First round exits back-to-back years. Context for sure, because guys were hurt, right? Giannis didn't play the first year in the playoffs. And then the following season, right, last postseason, Lillard gets hurt, right? Or he has the blood clots, misses the first game or two, and then comes back, isn't himself, then tears his Achilles. So we never really got to see a prolonged stretch in the playoffs of what it looked like, but it looked like it wasn't good enough based off of what we saw in the regular season, even though we know that there is a difference between the regular season and the playoffs. But like I said, now he goes back. Now, he won't play the first season because he'll be rehabbing, but now if you look at Portland, right, they have a pretty, I guess, I don't know if stacked is the right word, but they have a lot of guards because they already had a lot of bigs and they had to move or cut DeAndre Ayton in order to free up a spot and give it to Hanson Young. But now they also have multiple guards, right? Because you have Scoot and Shaedon Sharpe as your young guards, right? Because they moved on from Anthony Simons. Then you have Drew Holiday. And then I guess Dame Lillard as your other guard, right? Obviously Lillard won't play next season, so he won't start. But he'll be a mentor. He'll be a guy who can share a lot of things in terms of what it means to be a professional with the young players, which is important, right? Because we know he was one of the best players in the league for a long time. Before the last few years, he had been very durable, so he clearly took care of himself, of his body, and he got better pretty much every year. So a lot of things to like from that perspective. And if you're Portland, they're trying to put together a more serious basketball team. I don't think they'll be a playoff team next year, right? But just the fact that you have a mix of some vets, right? He goes back and plays with his buddy Jeremy Grant, right? Where I think he wanted them to re-sign him to a big contract to try to kind of help him out and try to convince him to stay. But just as a whole, definitely shocking and surprising because nobody had him going back to Portland, right? Everybody was saying it's probably going to be a contender. But here also there's a money factor, right? Because it's a 3-year, $48 or $42 million deal. right? And I think most of the other teams who would have signed him, it would have probably been like a minimum contract, right? And probably 2 years as well. I don't think it would. None of those teams would have given him like a 3-year deal, and it definitely wouldn't be a 3-year minimum. So he also gets the most money, so you can't really hate on that, right? I know that people have mentioned like, oh, he's clearly doesn't want to win. He's running away. It's just hard to give up that much of a financial difference, right? Because I mean, a minimum contract versus 3-year, $42 million. It's kind of hard to turn that down, right? Like obviously there's the Portland factor as well, but it also takes him off the market now, right? So, and obviously we had the Beal signing, so we'll get into that. But what do you think of this Dame Lillard reunion, right? Because obviously, other than 2 seasons in Milwaukee, he spent his entire career there, and pretty much as a Blazer, right, is number one in almost all their categories. Because we know that he was really good for them. Obviously, they never went to the finals or won a title, but they did make the playoffs almost every year. A lot of fun playoff runs and moments. Of course, a lot of them fell short. Just some of them were better teams or bad situations or whatever. But as a whole, like I can see why Blazers fans really like him, right? Because again, he's seems like a great guy, and at his peak, a very fun player to watch. It was kind of like the relationship with Houston and Harden, right? Because a lot of people would be like, well, his situation actually ended poorly, right? Because with Dame, it wasn't like he kind of just quit on the team and was like, yeah, no, thanks. I don't want to be here anymore. That was in the summer, right? Whereas with the Harden situation, it got very ugly. But either way, they love him because of all the deep playoff runs, and we get all that. But what do you think of Dame going
I
to
mean,
Portland?
it's cool. I think it's a good story, kind of like a storybook ending, I guess. For his career, right? Like you said, that's the team that drafted him. That's the team where he spent the majority of his career there. That's the team where he had the best years, right? That's the team where we all fell in love with his game, right? And that's where he was underrated, and will probably continue to be underrated for sure in terms of his productivity and stuff like that. And like you said, it's more of a thing where yeah, you can't turn that kind of money down because I mean, look at the security, financial security that gives you, right? Because you could look at Russell Westbrook, right? Like he's kind of walking around, kind of chasing veteran minimum contracts at this point, right? You don't really want to be in that boat. So shout out to Portland for being able to take care of him for sure. And I think this is going to be huge for a mentorship thing, right? I think this is like a good mentorship program that they could potentially build on. Now you have Damian Lillard, actually mentoring Scoot Henderson, and the other
Mhm.
guards, on the roster as well, like Shaden Sharp. I think it would be very cool. I'm curious to see, what approach Portland does take. Is this the final version of the roster? Because they could do more, right? They could move Drew Holiday if they want, or whatever the case may be. So, if this is the final form, it's cool because, like you said, they are deep at pretty much every position. You have a lot of promising young talent. You also have, solid veterans around to kind of, give the guys a calming presence. So I like what's brewing in Portland for sure. When I first heard the news, I was like, you got to be kidding me. Like, it didn't really make sense. But, now sitting on it, I think I feel better about it in terms of, okay, yeah, a lot of guaranteed money, 3-year deal. He's going to be out this season. So kind of like a mini farewell tour.
Yeah, sure. And that's the funny thing, right? Because we both predicted that he would end up whenever he signed going to playoff teams, right? I think you said Golden State. Levi said Boston,
Mm-hmm.
and he ended up choosing neither of those teams. But
Mm-hmm.
again, a lot of great moments there. So, like I said, it'll probably be his last 3 seasons in the league. Because by that point, I mean, how old is he right now? Like 34, 35. So yeah, he'll be like 38.
And what does he look like coming off the Achilles too?
Right, exactly. And that's the other thing. So but it is kind of wild though, right? Because again, like I said, I think most teams would have just offered him the minimum because not a whole lot of teams have the MLE left, and I just don't think they would have used it on Dame because, like you said, he's not gonna, and like I said, he's not gonna play this year, and he's gonna spend this year rehabbing. But he'll go back to Portland, and we'll see what he looks like coming off the Achilles. Yeah, he is 35, just turned 35 a few days ago. So, happy belated birthday to him, and congratulations on the 3-year deal. Hopefully, you enjoy going back to Portland and probably finishing out your career there. And I guess in theory, right, like he could be traded, but he does have a no trade. I think he has a no. Well, I think he's eligible for the no trade clause. I'm not sure if it's actually in there because the CBA is not or the contracts and whatnot is not a specialty of mine. I know a chunk of it, but I don't know that off the top of my head. So maybe there is like a world where they send him somewhere, but I don't think that happens. I think he just goes back there and retires because,
Yeah,
why even go back in the first place if that's the case?
true that.
Yeah. So moving on, we also did have, since the last time we recorded, Bradley Beal signed with the Los Angeles, or he's going to, once he gets, um, once he clears waivers. I believe he got bought out, right? So once all that happens, he'll be expected to join the Clippers on a 2-year, $11 million deal. So this is kind of what had been reported. I think the last time that we came on here, right, we basically said like it was already out there. He was probably going to go there. It's just now it'll be official once he clears waivers, right? And if you look at the Clippers again, like they had a pretty busy offseason, right? Because in addition to signing Bradley Beal, right, they moved Norman Powell basically to get John Collins. They brought in Brook Lopez as the backup center, right? And now they're bringing in Bradley Beal. They do have one more minimum contract spot. So reportedly, a lot of people think that they will use it to sign Chris Paul. We don't know yet for sure, but that's kind of what people are thinking right now. So, if you get Bradley Beal, Chris Paul, Brook Lopez, John Collins, like that's a really good offseason where, again, especially with the lack of front court depth that they had last year, right? They really only had Zubac as like your one real playable front court guy. Outside of that, it was like Nick Batum, who's also back with the Clippers, right? But he was like a small ball stretch five. And then other than that, it was Eubanks, who wasn't good enough to really play. Ben Simmons didn't really work out either in the playoffs. So they have a real legitimate front court rotation. And again, Powell was better than Beal last year, right? But in the playoffs, he wasn't that great, right? He was just okay, but he was clearly a step below what he was doing in the regular season. So I guess the thought process is, well, we'd rather have Bradley Beal at $5.5 million a year than have Norman Powell on a contract where we have to re-sign him and pay him however much money it would be per year. And then that puts us in, the apron and the cap and everything. So they did really good. I think the issue for me with the Clippers in general is it's very difficult to trust them, I think, in the postseason because it's just hard to factor in, like, are their guys going to be healthy? They're usually not, right? You have Harden on your team, right? Usually at some point in a playoff series, he's not able to come through, right? If it gets, deep into a playoff series, like 6, 7 games. So I don't trust them to be able to win 4 playoff series, but I would expect them to, worst case scenario, be somewhere around where they were last year, somewhere around a 50-win team, somewhere around a top 6 seed, and then they're good enough to win a playoff series. If everything works right, they could get to the conference finals, maybe really challenge whomever in the conference finals to get there. But either way, if you look at Bradley Beal, like, again, obviously he was much maligned for his time in Phoenix, but he wasn't the worst thing in the world. You know what I mean? Like, his numbers overall were relatively fine, given what you expect from him as a player, right? Like, he was basically 50-40 for Phoenix in his time there. But the issue is he can't stay healthy. And then, he's still, even though he can play off the ball and shoot, he does like to have the ball in his hands. And that's kind of where his best years in Washington were from an individual scoring standpoint. So, again, I think they can make all of that work offensively. It's just, again, you do have a lot of older guys, right? And especially your two main guys, Harden and Kawhi, right? They're both late into their careers. And then if you add Chris Paul on top of that, then I think you're starting to delve into the territory of, I think you have too many older players in your rotation that you're going to have to rely on. But you can't deny that they made, some good moves. I just don't think that they're, quite as good as like maybe the top 2, 3 teams in the Western Conference. Like they're not as good as Oklahoma City. I think Denver would still be better. But in fairness, they're going to be one of the better teams in the Western Conference. And like I said, if they are healthy, which we say this every year, which is why we kind of stopped believing in them after a while. If they're healthy, they can challenge a lot of these Western Conference teams. They're good enough to beat just about any of them. I just don't think that they can win 4 playoff rounds. But because they don't have their picks, they kind of have to be as good as they can be, right? There's really no point in being bad, especially with the financial stuff that they've been able to pull off. You're not even in the second apron having to pay a ton of money. And then from a Phoenix perspective, you get rid of Beal, because you didn't really need him anymore at this point, right? Obviously, they've moved on. They're in the next stage of their team where they're probably going to be, not very good, but you don't need Beal on that type of team. So now you can kind of completely focus on the guys that you have. Maybe they add one more random player in free agency. I don't know. But, and also they get under the second apron. So now they have a lot more financial flexibility too. Because there's no point in being there if your team's not going to be good enough, which they learned very quickly that, yeah, this team isn't really worth it to be in the apron. So for the Suns, financial flexibility, getting off a player that doesn't want to be there, that you don't want there either, right? Like he seems like a good guy, but I don't think the Suns wanted him there anymore because there was no point. Uh, and then, like I said, for the Clippers, you add on to the extra players, extra talent that you've been able to compile over the summer. So they've done a good job. I'm curious to see how all that works. Like, I guess in a lot of the games where Kawhi's out, Beal could end up being like the other guy next to Harden. And that seems like a pretty potent perimeter duo. And they were really good defensively last year, even with, Harden and Powell being your backcourt, which is not a great defensive backcourt, but it's because you got Zubac, you got other defensive wings, and they have a really good coach. So I like the moves that they made. Again, you can quibble over how much better is Powell or Beal over one or the other, but either way, like adding more talented players, I think is worth it. So they should be good. I don't have a problem really with this move.
Yeah, I like it. I don't have a problem with it either. It's kind of like you said, um, having Beal and his production on that cheap of a contract, it's a steal actually, very underrated. It's just a matter of, like you said, come postseason, what does this team look like, right? Are they fully healthy, and is everybody locked in, and are they ready to compete? Who knows what that looks like, right? I think there's going to be some things that they probably have to work out, but at the same time, Norman Powell and Bradley Beal, similar archetype, right? Need the ball in their hands, scorers, right? So it should be, in theory, a seamless fit. I am kind of intrigued by the fit and combo of James Harden, Kawhi, and Bradley Beal. It kind of reminds me of Phoenix, right? So I don't know, in terms of, is there enough ball to go around? I don't know. Because I think Beal is best when the ball is in his hands the majority of the time. So, and it's like you said, his years in Washington, when he was putting up 30, he was the number one option. Right now, you're kind of wavering between 2 and 3, and I don't know how that's going to look, right? Because you can't really relegate him to a spot up because he's not good enough defensively. So I am curious about it. It doesn't, instill a lot of faith like, yeah, this is a title team because they got Bradley Beal. No, I don't think it even shifts their title odds, if you want me to be honest. It does give me a sense of hope in terms of how they're moving because they're moving smart. They're not being dumb about it, right? And I feel like as long as you do have Kawhi on the team, you have a chance at a championship. So the door is not closed, but it doesn't make me feel much better than them this year.
Right.
How I would have felt last year. So
Yeah. What do you think of the John Collins edition? Because that's kind of the one that I feel like has mostly gone under the radar, just because he's just the guy that I don't think as many people really think about. Because he's been putting up he put up numbers on a bad Utah Jazz team, and we've liked him for a while. But how do you think he translates in combination with all the other guys that the Clippers have been putting on here?
yeah, I think it's underrated because John Collins wasn't even bad in Utah, right? Like, I mean, I could pull up his numbers, but I'm just going off of what I remember, right? Like, pretty impactful. So I think to have a guy like him on the roster is pretty cool. Then you bring in Brook Lopez, that's the front court depth as well. So like, if we're going to give them an early grade for their offseason, I think it would be an A. I think it's a home run because you're bringing in depth. You lost Norman Powell, cool, but you brought in Bradley Beal on the sweetest deal in the league. It might be the best contract in the league. In terms of, yeah, it's not a lot of money, but you're still getting a lot of productivity. So I love what they did in the offseason. John Collins, I think, will be a great Swiss Army knife for them. Front court depth. It's what they needed.
Yeah, I think his first year in Utah didn't go as well. I think he
Mm-hmm.
was much better in his second year.
Mm-hmm.
All right. But now again, Utah was a weird team, all the injuries, all the tanking. So it's kind of hard to know what's real and what isn't real, right? The last time we saw him in Atlanta, he did not have a great season. Shot the ball poorly, and didn't rebound the ball all that well. and then basically got dumped to Utah for nothing, right? It was like Rudy Gay, who didn't even play at that point. He basically, so it was basically just a salary dump.
Hmm.
So again, getting him basically for Norman Powell and then also picking up Bradley Beal and getting Brook Lopez, like those are good additions. Like I said, to me, I just don't really trust them come playoff time because I don't expect them to be able to last for 4 rounds. And, again, like, because we picked the Nuggets last year over the Clippers largely because of that, because we knew and acknowledged that the Clippers were really good and were good enough to beat Denver. It was hard to be able to bank and trust in them over the Nuggets, and that showed itself by the time they got to the game 7, right? Because and then the Clippers had a couple of games that they kind of bungled away, where you're like, man, they were this close to playing Oklahoma City. Who knows how well they do against Oklahoma City? Denver took them to 7. Maybe the Clippers also get them to 7. I don't know, but if you're the Clippers, that's how you look at it, right? It's like, well, we were really good last year, and we were this close to being in the second round, and who knows at that point. So why not make additions to make the team better? Because again, what's the alternative? The alternative is blowing it up, but it's hard to do that when you don't have any picks. So they're kind of forced into doing this. But at least I guess if you're a Clippers fan, like you have a team that should be a good team that will probably be relatively fun to root for. Like I think you're going in understanding you're probably not going to win the championship, but it's like you said, you have a player where if that's the best guy on your team, like you would on paper have a chance, right? It's just not as high of a chance as maybe some of the other teams, but we know when Kawhi is healthy and available, he can still be one of the best players in the league. It's just we don't get that as often anymore, right? Like, because last season was like the first time in forever where he was able to get through a postseason healthy, right? But then in the regular season, he played only like 37 games. So he played less than half the regular season.
Yeah.
Year before, right? The Clippers were really, really good because that was the first year that they had Harden. And he played, 68 games. And then right at the end, couldn't finish it off. And then we didn't really see him again aside from a couple playoff games where he clearly wasn't himself. So that's to me the hard part is I just can't bank on their stars come playoff time because one of them can't stay healthy and the other one I just don't think you can really trust in the biggest games. I mean, I feel like there's enough of a sample size for Harden now where not that he'll always have horrible playoff games, but it just kind of feels like when you need him the most, you just know he's probably not going to show up. And if that's going to happen, kind of hard to bank on that. But I think the hope is, well, with all these other offensive guys, maybe you don't have to have him have a crazy game. Like you could get away with him having a bad game if you have Beal and John Collins. But again, we saw that last year, right? Because that was supposed to be what Norman Powell was, but he wasn't good either. So
Beal
that's
concerns me in the playoffs too. I mean, we haven't
yeah,
really,
you're a Wizards
we
guy,
don't.
so what do you remember from the postseason? Because because the Wizards they didn't never had like a ton of deep runs. They
No,
had the one year, what was it, 2017, where
with
they
the
lost to
semis.
where they lost to Boston,
Yeah,
in Game 7,
yeah.
and and that was probably his best postseason run, unless you
Yeah.
want to consider like one of those post wall years.
No, no, no. Those don't count.
Right. So like so like what do you think? Because again, like you've seen him as much as anybody, right?
Yeah,
Because he was on your team for most of his career, right? Other than like 2 seasons.
yeah.
So, what do you think of how his game translates to the playoffs?
I mean, it's tough because he was so young at the time and he was different. He was a different player, right? He wasn't really the shot creator that we know today, right? He wasn't really as polished at all 3 levels. He was more so a great compliment to John Wall, could spot up, but there were times where it's like the mid-range game was there. Getting to the line was there as well. But there were also times where it's like, dude, what are you doing? So that's where I'm like, I don't really know what the best version of him looks like in the playoffs at this point in his career because he's more polished, he's more well-rounded, but I think that could lead to some negatives, right? In terms of maybe tunnel vision, turnovers, even like, in the in Phoenix. I know the team wasn't perfect and that team was not perfect by any means, but I think you
Mhm.
saw some gaping holes in his game, right? Because I mean, he was playing point guard at in Phoenix, but turnovers, bad shots, IQ, and he gets picked on defensively. So they're going to have to do some things, I think, as a team collectively. to kind of offset the negatives that he could potentially bring in the postseason. But the positives are there for sure because it will relieve so much pressure from Kawhi and James Harden because he's able to shot create and do more than just be a 3-point guy.
Yeah, in Washington, or for his career in the playoffs, he gives you 23, 4 and 4, 44 from the field, and 35 from three, right? Then if you look at that 2017 playoff run, right, he averaged 25, 3 and 3, shot 47 from the field, only 29% from three on 8 attempts a game, right? So, but in the playoffs, like so I guess in the playoffs, his 3-point percentage is lower than it is in
Normal.
the regular, which is normal.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of a normal thing. Usually, guys don't shoot quite as well in the play, and that's okay, right? As long as they don't look like a completely different version of himself. So I think like as a playoff guy, he's fine. It's just a matter of again, what do you think the ceiling for what do you think the most likely outcome for the Clippers is? Because like I said, I think it's more than likely second round, maybe conference finals if everything goes right. I think it's hard for me to make the case for them to really realistically get to the finals. Maybe they could if literally everything went right, but I think it's more than likely like second round and then maybe conference finals at best. But maybe you're thinking higher than I do.
No, I think conference finals is probably their peak. I know that might sound like a cop out, but it's the truth, right? Because we already know some sort of flame out is possible. If they get to the Western Conference Finals, and depending on what the landscape looks like there, like say they're going up against maybe a little bit of an inexperienced team, or a team that's a little bit injury battered, then I would probably pick the Clippers to win that and get to the finals because of the fact that they have a guy like Kawhi. But like I said, it depends on who the matchup would be. But I think realistically, talent wise, if we're just going off of that and coaching as well, for sure, Western Conference Finals is easily their peak.
Yeah, that's what like I said, I think conference finals is probably the ceiling. Second round I think is most likely.
Yeah.
I just think for them to get past the conference finals, I think they'd have to not play Oklahoma City. Like
Fair.
I think that they could be good enough to beat these other teams potentially, but I don't really trust that they could be able to beat Oklahoma City in a 7-game series. Maybe. Cuz again, the argument against Oklahoma City going into this season would be nobody's gone back to back in almost a decade. They haven't even gotten past the second round. And then, teams have had issues staying healthy in back to back years because it's a long regular season and postseason grind. And the argument is some of these teams got better, right? But then the case for Oklahoma City is, well, it's a young team. A lot of their young guys, in theory, should be better or should look better. They're running it back. So they're not really having to integrate any new pieces and spend time doing that. So I just think in general, I think that Oklahoma City will be better even if they don't win 68 games. I think they'll be a tougher out this time around if they're healthy, right? Which is an if because we have not, there have been teams that didn't, like Denver in the postseason 2 seasons ago, right? I guess Murray had some weird stuff going on. Right, but they weren't like horrifically injured, right? Like they were more banged up this year than they were last year, right? Because like Gordon had the calf or hamstring, and then Murray had the illness or whatever it was. But just as a whole, that's kind of where I'm at with a lot of it. But like, what do you think of the Western Conference as a whole, right? Because now Clippers have gotten better. Obviously, I will probably at some point do our offseason stuff like we usually do,
come up.
right? But just as a whole, like a lot of these teams have got better. But do you feel like these teams could realistically challenge Oklahoma City? Or are you still kind of in the sphere of still not really banking on any of these teams beating Oklahoma City?
Yeah, it's tough because I feel like the landscape has changed, but not all that much. I think Oklahoma City is still number one, but everyone else is kind of clamoring for that number 2 and number 3 spot, like certified, right? Because like you look at Houston, great offseason, but does it put them number 2 consensus? Like what's the consensus on them? I don't know. We have to kind of see it in action. What does KD look like being the number 1 option on a team like this where, it's all wings pretty much? We have to kind of see. The Lakers, what do they look like, right? What does Denver look like? I think Denver's one to watch because they really did make a massive move in moving Michael Porter Jr. and then bringing in a lot of talent, in depth. So that's going to be a new look Nuggets team. Clippers as well. You put them in there, put them into the fold. Minnesota, that's one that I have my eye on. I'm looking at a lot of internal development. And what does that team look like? Golden State, I feel like they potentially might take a step back because I think they're like one of the only Western Conference teams that didn't really do jack diddly squat.
Waiting for them to do some stuff potentially. That's what's been.
Exactly. Then you got to look at Dallas. What do they look like come playoff time? San Antonio, with the addition of Dylan Harper. It's crazy. I think the Western Conference is going to be a bloodbath again, but realistically, right now, I think Oklahoma City's still in a league of their own. But Houston, I think, is very close.
Yeah, I think in terms of like the Western Conference tiers, like I think Oklahoma City should be. I think they've earned the right to be in the number one tier. Now, obviously, it wasn't like it was a complete cakewalk in the Western Conference. They smashed Memphis and they smashed Minnesota for the most part. But, Denver took them to 7 games. And then obviously the Pacers took them to 7 games.
Yeah.
Who knows what happens if Halliburton's Achilles doesn't tear. But,
True.
I think the argument is they'll be better this year. And, if they're better, how much better do these other teams need to be? And then, like you said, it's kind of like, well, what's the next tier? Right? Because like you said, Denver is a more proven team than Houston. Even though Houston, like you said, had a great offseason, we need to see some other things from Houston. Like we need to see if Amen Thompson, does he take a leap? Because he's probably the swing piece, right? If he can become all-star plus level guy, that would probably put Houston like right there with any of those other teams, aside from maybe Oklahoma City. Because he's kind of the guy that you look at where it's like of all their young players, he's got the highest ceiling. And, if he can fix some of the issues offensively with his game, then he becomes a very complete player and a guy that you could probably rely on more in the postseason compared to what we saw, where he was a little bit more up and down. He figured stuff out as that Golden State series went on, right? Because initially he was settling for a lot of these short range shots that he could make in the regular season, but they didn't work in the playoffs.
Yeah.
Then as the series went on, it's like, well, I can just barrel through everybody,
Thank
right?
you. Should have been doing that.
Right, but once he adds the other offensive elements to his game, right, I think that will help him take off. But as of right now, we don't know yet. We expect him to be better, but we have to see it. And then, like with Denver, they got better, right? And they were very close to beating Oklahoma City last year. So maybe they could do it. And then that's kind of after that, then you're kind of trying to figure out what tier is everyone else in, right? Like, are they all in a tier 2 all together, like Houston, Denver, Minnesota, LA, or like in Golden State and all these other teams? Or do you put like Houston and Denver in tier 2 and then like everybody else is kind of in tier 3, and then you kind of have to see like maybe they have a chance to move up? Because the thing with Minnesota is they haven't really made any real moves either, right? Like they're mostly running it back aside from Nickeil Alexander-Walker, right? But I think the hope is, well, they were in the conference finals last year. They have Ant, so maybe he gets better. Maybe one of their other, like Rob Dillingham, maybe he becomes a real factor. Like he has to be an actual part of the rotation in order for them to be better than last year. Because otherwise, they'll probably be about the same, which I don't think is good enough unless they don't face Oklahoma City. Like if it's like Minnesota, Denver conference finals or somebody else, okay, they could do it. I don't think they're good enough. I don't think they have enough ball handling at that perimeter spot in order to really be able to get past Oklahoma City. I don't see that. Unless, like I said, they make some move that I don't expect, or one of their other guys takes a leap. So that, like, where are you on Minnesota? Because, we said, like, it's a team to look out for, but do you feel like that they're right in the same group as, say, like, Denver, Houston? Or, like, would you put them, like, slightly below? Like, where do you see them?
No, they're in the same group for sure. And it starts with Ant.
And I'd say that, too. Say that, too.
I think they're in the same tier as Houston.
Mhm.
They've got a lot of young pieces. They've got a young superstar. They've got the defensive identity. It kind of comes down to, like you were talking about, the offensive consistency, right? Where's your playmaking going to come from? Where's your ball handling going to come from outside of Ant? Well, got to look at Rob Dillingham, and potentially Terrence Shannon Jr. I don't know what that looks like, but you're kind of banking on, internal development, which is why I'm kind of high on him, because I think they have what it takes to, ascend those pieces and get them right for the playoffs. And if they can do that, it's going to be a special team for sure. And I think Ant is going to get better. I think this upcoming season, is probably going to be his best one.
Yeah, and that's why, yeah, I think it's fair to put them in that, especially because they've had the recent success where I think you have to put them in that tier. It's the other teams where I think once you get past Houston, Denver, Minnesota, unless you feel like one of those teams is in tier three, then I think tier three is probably just about everyone else. Because then that's where you have, like Clippers, Lakers, Golden State, and all those other teams that you might want to put in there. Well, I mean, I guess like Memphis, you'd probably put in like tier four because I don't think that they're quite as good as maybe some of the other teams we just mentioned, but I don't think they'll be horrible,
Yeah,
right?
I
So
agree with you.
we'll see what comes with that. But, I guess should we maybe talk a little bit more about Golden State, right? Because obviously, two guys in Beal and Dame who were potentially guys who could have gone there. Now they're not. And they're still waiting on this Kuminga situation, right? And, supposedly, right, according to reports, he's hoping to get maybe like 25 million a year or so, right? That comes from Jake Fisher. He wants somewhere around that. And he is at this point willing to take a short-term deal to make it happen. But again, the issue is does Golden State probably right away doesn't want to do that. And then another team would have to be willing to do that. Now, Phoenix has been mentioned now as a team that could potentially go for it, but obviously Phoenix would have to think about which guys they want to send out. It's been thoughts about could be like a Grayson Allen and someone else. If you're Golden State, is that what you want? Right? Like I think the main thing is like I don't think anybody is ideally going to get what they want unless it's like Kuminga will be happy going to another team because I just don't see like a real great return for Kuminga because if that was going to happen, it would have already happened. Like there would have already been some type of deal where they get somebody back. Because right now it seems like they haven't done anything, but supposedly the guys that could go there are kind of just waiting around, right? Like Al Horford and DeAnthony Melton, they're just waiting because I think the Kuminga situation will kind of determine how much money they can get. Like if he just re-signs with Golden State on a big contract, I think they can only really get minimums. And then maybe if somebody's willing to give him a little bit more, then maybe they don't sign there, but they probably will. And then if it's a sign and trade, then I think they get the MLE and then they probably just split it between those guys. But what do you think of all this?
Yeah, the Warriors are not doing too hot. On, like I said earlier, they're like one of the only teams that hasn't done anything. So I am kind of curious what the thought process is. Obviously, they're clearly trying to handle the Kuminga situation, but I mean, what are they expecting in return? That's my kind of question, right? Like at this point, you're not gonna get a star. So you kind of just have to take what's given. But I don't know. It's one of the weirder situations in the league right now. So I am curious what the end result is gonna be. But the fact that they didn't improve scares me, and I'm not even a Warriors fan, so I can only imagine how those guys are feeling. Like they don't have a plan at all. It seems like. I mean, granted, Curry and Jimmy Butler is a phenomenal duo, but is that enough to get you to the finals? Obviously, I would think that would be the goal, but I don't think that that's possible. Not with that team.
Yeah, so according to Anthony Slater, now I believe of ESPN, I believe he left the Athletic to go to ESPN if I'm not mistaken. But basically, he put out there, he reported that Golden State, this was on July 4th, is supposedly seeking a quote unquote promising young player and first round draft pick in exchange for him. I don't think they're going to get that.
No,
Maybe they do,
no.
but and then let's say he goes to Phoenix. Would you like that for Phoenix?
Yeah, for sure. But
Mhm.
it's like you said. What's the return going to be? Is Golden State going to
Right.
bite on that?
Yeah,
Absolutely not.
because they don't really because the problem is they don't really have a lot of first round picks available, right? Because they gave them all up, right, for the moves that they've done as of late. And then in terms of promising young players, like what's the promising young player that Phoenix has where Golden State's like, yeah, well, we like him. We think he could be the centerpiece of a Kaminga deal. Like, who is it? So
Jalen Green. That's the only one I can think of. I mean,
right, so
you probably wouldn't want Ryan Dunn in
mhm.
exchange.
Yeah, and you'd have to figure out money-wise how all that would work.
That's what I'm
I guess
saying.
in a sign and trade right now, it would be a scenario where it's like they get back less. So, like, say they give him a $25 million deal,
Mm,
they don't get back 25 million. I think it's like half or something like that. So I don't know. But it sounds like this is going to be a while before this gets resolved. And like you said, it kind of sucks for Golden State because they clearly have moves, or maybe not clearly, but reportedly they have moves that they want to make, but they can't make them right now. And right now they're falling behind. Where, like you said, they haven't made any moves, and all these other teams have gotten better. I think regardless of whatever moves they do, I think, like you said, it's going to be really tough for them to be able to get to the finals and win it all, just because of the fact that, you're especially, and it's not that he's a bad signing at all if it happens, but like, it's like what I said with the Clippers, where once you add Al Horford, that's about close to half of your main rotation. That's 35 plus, right? Where you're just kind of starting to get into the tier of that might be too many older players that you have to rely on. And, we know now that the NBA season is a grind because you have to get through both the 82 game season and the playoffs. Like, we've seen teams kind of, I don't know, kind of like hang around and then just kind of get hot in the postseason. But if you want to actually win the title, you basically have to be a 50 plus win team. And I think they're good enough to win 50 games, potentially, but I don't think that they're probably quite good enough to be able to last and get through 4 playoff rounds, right? Like, and I know this was a potentially one time thing, but we just saw Steph, right? Unfortunately, have a hamstring injury last postseason, right? Against the Timberwolves. And, that hadn't really happened before, but he's also 37 and he'll be 38 next year. And then on top of that, you got Butler, right, who also had some injury issues of his own,
mhm.
but that's kind of a regular thing for him. So, and then on top of that, you got Draymond, and then potentially if they add Horford, right? Like, I just think that kind of crosses the threshold of how many older guys do you really want in a playoff series? And we know all those guys can be playoff performers that you'd want on your team. It's not that you don't want them. It's just having all of them together, and then you have to bank on them having to go through a regular season with a bunch of young athletic teams. That's not what you want. Like, ideally, it'd be great if Kuminga could just be the guy that they want him to be. Then you just re-sign him. Then you figure it out. But doesn't seem like that's the case. And it seems like the main issue, like, so I know Logan Murdoch of The Ringer, he mentioned, like looking guys off and kind of going for his own. But it's also the defense because, we've watched Kuminga many times. And I think one of the aspects of his game that's really disappointing is how is this guy not an elite defender, right? Because, that was kind of a thing with Wiggins where, prior to coming to Golden State, everybody's like, he's got long arms, he's a great athlete, but he's doesn't seem like he, does a whole lot defensively. He's kind of in and out, wavers a lot. Same thing with Kaminga, right? Where I think if he actually was like a high level defender, he probably like wouldn't have as many issues in terms of them getting mad and getting ticked off because
Yeah,
then it basically just banks on does he have it or not offensively? And if he doesn't, then what's the point,
for sure.
right? Because, even though, yeah, he can hit a 3 point shot, nobody guards him, right, from three. They're kind of just like, we don't care. Now he's super athletic, so he can just get downhill and just plow through guys and score, right? But just as a whole, I think that's kind of the main issue with him. Like, I know people also mention the other stuff, like maybe late decision making and other things like that. But I just think defensively, if he was one of the best defenders on the team, then there wouldn't really be. Then it's kind of like, well, if he doesn't give you 20, whatever, because you have other guys that can give you some offensive production, even though you'd like for him to be able to score. And that's kind of what we talked about, where it's just the player he wants to be is not the player that they probably need him to be. But it sucks because for him, obviously he wants his money, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, funny enough, like we forget about it, but he actually already has a ring. He wasn't really like a big factor on that Warriors team. But as of right now, since he's still really young, he's trying to, at least as of right now, prioritize money and playing time and opportunity. And that's probably the best pathway for him to get as much money as he can is to be on a team where he's going to consistently play and he's going to have a consistent role. And we already know it's just not going to work out with Golden State. Like, not the biggest fan of his, but you can't deny he's like a good player. Like, he's good enough where he could be, where he probably shouldn't just have like an up and down role. Like wherever he goes, he should have a consistent role, but it's not going to work here, right? In addition to all the other fit concerns. And that's the tough part of trying to balance out young guys and veterans because, it's like you have to let these guys play through their mistakes, but if you're trying to contend, you can't really afford to have these guys make mistakes. Think about the last couple of years prior to the Butler trade, all the close games that Golden State would lose in the regular season where they're right there, then something happens at the end of the game and they can't get it done, and then that's an extra loss. An issue that seemingly has been resolved with the Butler situation. But, as long as Kuminga's on the roster, you need him to be effective and you need him to be good. But if there's a gap between how the front office and the coaching staff sees him, you really have no real choice but to move on from him. But they may kind of be forced into a situation where if nobody's willing to give him a big contract, because I can understand why nobody would want to give him a $25+ million a year deal too, because I don't think he's that level of player. But if that's going to happen, then Golden State may be forced to re-sign him to a short-term deal, bring him in, hope that everything goes okay, and just kind of accept that, like, yeah, we have a guy on our team that we don't really want, that we're going to have to move at the deadline. But I think at that point, you're already drawing dead because we already know that in order to win the title, you need to be good from the start. Like, ideally, you need to have as much of the best parts of your team as possible going into the season. And if Kuminga's on the roster, you're not going to have that. And I just don't think you can really pick them to have a real chance at winning the championship. And even if they move him and get something back, I still don't think that would be good enough. But at least you'd have a conclusion, and at least you can move on and be like, all right, what's the real ceiling of this team as currently constructed? Which I'd say kind of like the Clippers, like more than likely second round, probably not much further, maybe conference finals if everything goes right, regardless of what happens.
Yeah, depending on who they play in the first round,
Right.
I could see them losing. If you want me to be honest.
Yeah, and like that, and that's the funny thing is you can make that case with all of these teams,
Yeah,
right? Like
exactly.
aside from Oklahoma City is the only one where, like, you'd be pretty shocked if they lost in the first round. Maybe you might say like Denver or Houston, but again, I need to see what the other parts around Durant look like for me to, confidently pick them to make a deep playoff run. And then, like, if Denver plays Minnesota in the first round, like, we've seen them lose to Minnesota already. Now, again, they added some new guys, so maybe they're just going to be better than Minnesota anyways. But just as a whole, that's kind of where a lot of these teams are at right now.
Yeah, it's wild.
Then,
It's just crazy.
then I guess moving on, right? Then we'll just because I guess we might as well, right? Some other Lakers stuff, right? So this comes from Anthony Irwin, Lakers insider, Clutch Points. Now, there was more to this story, right? But the headline that most people ran away with was like LeBron James reportedly frustrated with Lakers' lack of direction since Westbrook trade. Now, again, like I said, there was already more to this story. That's the main thing that people took away. But, from the article, on LeBron James' side, real frustration over the Lakers' lack of direction since the Westbrook trade. Whole thing has become pretty awkward. And yet, the reality is they're both better off with each other. There's no trade the Lakers would make that would give James a better chance at a title than he has playing with Doncic. And he also mentioned that he thinks the most likely situation is probably stays in LA, still probably retires with the Lakers. But obviously, again, we know that there's been at least some level of tension as of late, just because of, I guess probably how the offseason has gone. They added Ayton, right? Which they were very fortunate to be able to do that because nobody pegged him as a buyout guy, right? Most people thought if he gets moved, it's probably a trade. We know we've talked about the Lakers' potential plans, right, for 2027, where they're maybe hoping and praying that like a Giannis or a Jokic comes into the building and then saves them and pairs them with Luka. But what do you think of all that's been going on?
Uh, what's an off season without Laker drama?
Mm-hmm.
But it is wild. I think Bron will probably finish his career as a Laker. I don't think there's any reason that he wouldn't. I mean, sure, there's somewhat of a rift, I guess, between him, the front office, and whatever. But realistically, right? I mean, where on earth would he go that doesn't completely destroy that other team, where he would be going, right? Because you'd have to give up a decent amount considering, the money or whatever. But yeah, I don't think we're looking at a buyout. I don't think we're looking at anything crazy. I think it's going to be a normal Lakers season, and we just have to see what they look like come postseason. Because I think,
Yeah.
getting DeAndre Ayton was great, but there is still more work to be done, but their hands are kind of tied. So I do understand the frustration from that perspective, but it should be a new era, right? It's new ownership. You got a new franchise star in Luka Doncic. And I mean, yeah, the here and now is cool. It'd be great if you could win a title, but let's look at, a couple years down the line, which is why I like the approach of the whole free agency thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you also had Brett Siegel from Clutch Points say that based off of what he was doing in Vegas, that some people think he could retire after the season. Now I don't know which one is true because we know and understand that there's a lot of different sources in Lakerland. So like what one person gets information wise might be different from what someone else gets because there's a lot of different people that operate in the Laker information sphere. Like I said, I feel like we probably would have already gotten some type of indication that he'd be retiring if it was going to happen. I could be wrong.
I agree.
Maybe he announces it later in the summer. Um, do you think he announces he retires going into this season? You think this will be his last one?
No, I think he's got 2 years left. That's how I feel about it. Yeah.
And then just I guess from some Laker offseason building, like so they lost Dorian Finney-Smith. They brought in DeAndre Ayton and Jake LaRavia. And after that, right, then I guess they drafted a Adu Thiero in the second round.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing you're kind of waiting on is, well, okay, so you got to do something about either adding some type of defensive guard or adding some type of defensive wing, and we don't know what that is. Now, July 20th, supposedly or reportedly, is the deadline to guarantee Shake Milton's contract, right? They're probably going to wait as long as possible in the hopes that maybe you might find a way to put him in a trade, or they just waive him, right? So I think it's probably more likely that they just waive him. And everybody was waiting on the Beal situation too, because now that the Beal situation is done, I think all of these other teams are going to try to figure out like what happens with Chris Paul, what happens with Westbrook, what happens with all these other guys that are just kind of waiting around. So maybe there's some move in the works, but again, we don't know about it because the Lakers don't really leak a lot of stuff. But those would be the type of targets you'd hope for. Again, I think it'd be the same thing as those other teams, right? Where chances are, as currently constructed, they're probably like ceiling is second round. I don't think they could probably go much further than that as currently constructed because I don't think they have enough defensively.
Mm-hmm.
And you still have to be able to, you still have to be able to get through 4 rounds healthy. But I think the main thing is just defensive talent. They don't have enough for me to feel confident about them being able to make it past the second round and get to the finals. And maybe if they do that through trade, then maybe you feel like, okay, maybe they're kind of in the realm of conference finals is the ceiling if they can get more defense. Because I think with teams like the Clippers and Golden State, I think you can just bank on them being better defensive teams in the postseason. But, I think worst case scenario, the Lakers, like those teams, should still be good. Like they should be another team that's somewhere around 50 games, top 6 seed. And if they get the right matchup, they can win a playoff series. But like you said, I understand the frustration because you know that they have to do more. And it just feels like there's a lot of different plans that we're hearing about, and you're not sure which one is which. Because it could also be possible that the 2027 thing may not actually be what they're going to do. We don't know. Like that's been the reporting, but maybe something else falls into their lap. And then it's like, well, let's roll with this. So who knows what's going to happen with that front. But, right now we're just kind of waiting it out, right? Because, we're in July and there's still some offseason stuff that has to be done. And then also, I guess you also have a little bit more of summer league left.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's tough because I think realistically you can't get to the finals or even probably the Western Conference finals looking like how you look right now, right? Like, and it goes back to what you were talking about. Luka's your guy. So what do you have to do? You have to surround him with athletic defensive talent, and there's not enough of that. There's some of that on the team, but not nearly enough to replicate what the Mavs were able to do.
Right, and some of those guys are just not quite as good. Like, say, like a Vanderbilt, right? When he first got there, right, he was kind of a revelation, but in the last couple of seasons, he's been hurt. And then offensively, there's just not enough there to really feel confident about him being like a real playoff rotational piece. Because he really couldn't do as much in the postseason for them the first year he was there, anyways, right? Like he started, but then as the series went on, he played less and less and less.
Hmm.
And it just
Hmm.
kind of feels like he'll probably just never really be offensively good enough. And, it'd be okay if he could, we know he can't really shoot, but he's also not really even a strong finisher.
Nope.
Like that's kind of like, a layup is kind of an adventure for him. Even a dunk is kind of an adventure, right? I guess that's kind of the reason why some people have mentioned like a GP2. He's just so much smaller. He's 6'2".
Yeah.
But just as a whole, like you said, like we know the roadmap for what like an ideal or close to ideal type of defensive group of guys next to Luka is, and that's not like you said what LA has right now. Maybe they might be able to figure it out through trade. Seems like the Wiggins thing is kind of dead, right? Which again, they don't want to give up a first and other stuff. It's understandable. But then you're gonna have to look elsewhere, right? And what that is it in Portland? Is it somewhere else? I'm not sure, but we'll see.
Yeah.
And then last but not least, Summer League pretty much winding down. A lot of guys have been shut down. Are there any other guys that you've seen as of late that have kind of caught your eye that maybe we didn't talk about as much last time?
Um, I mean, I liked what I've seen from Queen. Um,
Hmm.
I know that we talked about him lightly, but yeah, I've enjoyed what I've seen from a lot of these guys. Yeah, most of the top guys have been shut down. I think VJ Edgecombe actually played since the last time we talked. That
I
wasn't
think
too
he did,
bad.
yeah.
So,
Mhm.
impressed. I've been very impressed with the quality of this draft class already. I think the potential is through the roof with all the top guys, and I think there's a lot of those hidden gems littered in there. So you can kind of see why teams traded up, like to get Hansen Yang or Derek Queen, right? So I think there are a bunch of underrated gems there for sure.
Yeah, another guy that I think we didn't mention, but we both talked about in the draft was Neat Clifford for the Kings, right?
Yeah,
Where he's come in and he's actually played very well and kind of showcased a lot of different things like playmaking, defense, rebounding, athleticism, scoring. And again, this was a pick that a lot of people liked. So that could be another guy where, has a real chance to crack the Kings rotation. They have a lot of guards, so that may be a little bit tough for him to get in. But, he's got enough length and size to maybe play, at that three spot, maybe in some of those smaller lineups, right? He's like 6'5", kind of, but he's a bigger 6'5". So, if he can get some real minutes and be an impactful guy, because he's a little bit, he's not like a young guy, right? He's a little bit older, right? He was a college senior, so he's like 22 or so, 23. So he should be a guy in theory that should be able to play for the Kings right away. Like, and so we'll see what that looks like because I don't know really what to make of the Kings right now. But at the very least, it seems like the draft pick, they did a good job with him.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And then uh, actually, it's funny. I know we don't have to spend a ton of time on it, but you guess you kind of have to give him some credit, right? Because we talked about it at the time when he didn't play very well. There's a fellow who, in his second year, who did play very well in the summer league, Ronnie James.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, yeah, like honestly, like again, we know defensively he's still really good, but on the offensive end, there's been some real growth, some playmaking growth. Again, that Lakers summer league team has been very weird, very ugly. Not really a lot of good players on there. Some of that's been just some guys have been hurt. Like Thiero didn't play because he came in with an injury. I think the Eric Dixon guy, one of their two-way guys, also didn't play. And then Baisley now he's out. He was in a wheelchair, I think, in one of those games. So that's not great. But just as a whole, it is a flipped script because obviously we know it's the summer league, so you always have to take stuff with a grain of salt. But last year at this time, he was not very good in the summer league, and we all talked about it. We didn't spend a ton of time just because we knew that he wasn't going to play a ton for the Lakers his rookie year. I don't think he'll play a ton this year either. But just as a whole, it's from his perspective good to see. It seems like he's making some real progress. And we kind of thought that, like, worst case scenario, we think he can be an NBA rotational player. Will he be a star? That's kind of where probably not. But, at the very least, like, he looks like there looks like there's some real signs that, hey, he's shown growth. He looks good. He's probably been their best player in the summer league, which is great for him. It's not a good thing for the Lakers summer league team, but, given everything that happened a year or so ago, with the heart and everything else, right? It's a good thing to see.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed watching, what I've seen from him. The shot creation, I think, is pretty cool. The confidence, I think, you can feel that he's getting a better sense of the game. He already had a good sense, but it you could definitely see the progression, right? It looks much better than last year. And yeah, I think the confidence is through the roof. So shout out to him for having some great performances.
Yeah, and the athleticism part also
Yeah.
shows out too, right?
Hmm.
Because that's kind of the part where we're like, well, he's kind of undersized, even though he's got a physical frame, right? He's still what, 6'2", 6'3".
Hmm.
So
But doesn't have the
he
capabilities to be the one.
right. Yeah, and
So
at least now, yeah, you're seeing some on-ball growth. Again, will that translate as well to the NBA? That I'm not sure. We'll have to see. Probably not next season. Like, I don't think he'll be a rotational guy next season. But, he spent a lot of time in the G League, and that's kind of a lot of what they did, where they gave him a lot of on-ball reps, because the G League is kind of very different style of play from the NBA.
hmm
So that's good to see. But, again, that Lakers summer league team was not very good. And again, like, there's other guys that are hurt and whatnot, but at least, like, in a sea of mediocrity, right? Like, he stands out in a good way, right? Which is great for him, and I hopefully bodes well going forward. Because, like I said, maybe by the time he gets to year 3, maybe he could be like a real rotational piece for them. I mean, hopefully he will be, anyways. But next year, it's still probably going to be, if he's playing a lot, something probably went wrong. But, in theory, hey, he is one of the better athletes. So, like, that archetype of player would be nice to have in the rotation. I don't see it as much this year. Even though, again, he's had a great summer league, looks much improved, and looks like he's on his way to being a real rotational player. So
Yeah.
just wanted to shout that out.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, so news and rumors going on. Again, most of what we talked about is kind of the news and rumors thing here. So there's not really a whole lot to say from that perspective. So we might as well just kind of close it out, get into the usual things that we do, right, with polling and whatnot. So our last IG post that we had was, will Hansen Young be a star, right? And that was in relation to our short where we talked about the different stuff in the summer league, standouts and players like that. And 100% said no, right? Now, again, he's looked good in the summer league, right? We saw him in person a little bit, and you can definitely see he's got some really good starting points, especially on the offensive end. And, he, based off of, what we've seen, he probably will be a real rotational guy for them this season. Again, what will it look like defensively? Probably not great, but Portland does have a lot of good defensive players, so that should help in theory. But I don't know. I don't know if I can bank on him. Like, I don't know if I can 100% say he will be a star, but he looks like he'll be a good player. Worst case scenario, like, offensively, he should be a good player. It's just, again, I think, like, ideally, if you want him to be the best version, it kind of has to be, good starting center. Because if he's just like a offensive playmaking hub off the bench, I think there's kind of not really a high ceiling to those type of players. So if you're high on him, you almost kind of have to say, yeah, his ceiling is starting level center, worst case scenario, potential star level big ceiling.
Yeah, I'd agree because I think there's serious flaws with his game on both ends of the floor, right? Like he's not the quickest. He may have the height and stuff, but you could definitely tell that the lack of athleticism affects his game offensively as well because, if an athlete is on him, can easily just send it to the fifth row. You know what I mean? But that's where his IQ and his finesse, can come into play. And that's where I do understand the Şengün and Jokic comparisons or whatever. But I mean, to be fair, I think you and I, from the small sample size that we saw, were fairly impressed. So I would go ahead and agree that he could be a star. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I agree with that.
Yeah.
So that pretty much concludes today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know in the comments your thoughts on, the situations that we've already talked about. Dame Lillard going to Portland, Beal going to the Clippers. Of course, the drama with all these other teams. And let us know your thoughts on the Summer League. What do you think of some of the players that have stood out? What do you think of Hansen Young? And if you want to join in on these polls, follow us at the OPT podcast on any of our socials. Drop a comment. We'll read it at the end of the video. And continue to like and subscribe. Help the channel grow. We appreciate all the support. We'll see you next episode.